So we've already discussed solving quadratic equations with the zero product property and factor property, as well as the quadratic formula. Now what we're going to do is we're going to solve other types of equations. So the first type of equation that we're going to solve is where we have not just an x squared, but maybe an x to the third or an x to the fourth here. So what we want to do first is we want to try to factor this into what we call a sum or difference of cubes. So whenever I look at this, what I'm going to do is that 8 can be rewritten as 2, 2, and 2. Let me spread those out just a little bit. Okay, so let's see here. A 2, a 2, and a 2, and the x to the third is x times x times x. So I have these three different terms for this 8x to the third. Minus 1 can be rewritten as 1 times 1 times 1. Now whenever I'm looking at a difference or sum of cubes, I'm going to have the first set of parentheses as 2 possible terms, and the second set as 3 possible terms. And what happens is this first one comes into this first blank. These last two get multiplied back together, so 2x times a 2x, and they go into this first blank of the second set. So that's 4x squared. Now the first one comes to this first blank. These two get multiplied back together. 1 times 1 still gives me 1. The middle term right here is actually these two multiplied together. So 2x times a 1 gives me a 2x. Now my signs are always same as what I start with, opposite of what I start with, and always positive. So we have factored out this 8x to the third minus 1. So we have a 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. And we have a 4x squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. Now this one I can go ahead and solve because it just has an x to the first power. So I get 2x is equal to 1. So x is equal to a 1/2. Leave it as fractions because when we're working with these, we want them as exact as possible. So especially if you end up with like a 1/3 or a 1/6 or something, those are repeating decimals and we don't want to use those. So this particular one does not factor, so we have a 4x squared plus 2x plus 1 equal to 0. So what we're going to do is use that quadratic formula to solve this. So we're going to have x is equal to a negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So notice all I've done so far is just plugged in numbers, watching my signs, things of that nature. So I'm going to get x is equal to a negative 2 plus or minus square root. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 4 times 1 is a 16, minus because of this minus. 2 times 4 is 8. So I get x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of a negative 12 over 8. Notice I've ended up with a negative, so that means I'm going to have some i's in here. 12 can factor down into a negative 4 times a 3, because I know what the square root of 4 is. So x is going to be negative 2 plus or minus 2i, because of this negative 4 That square root of 4 is 2, and I've got a negative, so that comes out as an I. Square root of 3 over 8. Now these numbers outside the radical, I can simplify all of those by dividing each one of them by a 2. So I get that x is equal to a negative 1 plus or minus 1i square root of 3. If you want to just put the I there, that's fine. I divided both of these by 2, so I'm going to divide my denominator by 2, and I get a 4. So I actually have 3 possible answers here. I have my x equal to a 1/2 from the first set of parentheses. Then I also have that x is equal to a negative 1 plus I square root of 3 over 4. And that x is equal to a negative 1 minus I square root of 3 over 4. So I have 3 possible answers, which is what I should end up with because that's my largest exponent. Let's look at one that might be a little bit more straightforward. We have 3x to the 4th is equal to 12x. Remember, most of these, whenever I start them out, I'm going to move everything to one side. So I'm going to get 3x to the 4th minus a 12x is equal to 0. I can factor this sum. I can take out a GCF of a 3x, leaving me with an x to the 3rd minus 4 is equal to 0. Now I'm going to set each one of these equal to 0, so 3x is equal to 0, and that x to the 3rd minus 4 is equal to 0. Well, 3x equals 0, divide by 3, I get x is equal to 0. Now over here, it's a little bit different because I don't have a 4 doesn't come out equally where I'm trying to factor. So in this case, what we're actually just going to do is we are going to set the x to the 3rd is equal to the 4th, and I'm going to take the cube root of both sides. So I'm going to take the cube root of both sides. Now remember, where we had the square root, we had to take the positive and the negative. That was because a negative 2 squared was 4, a positive 2 squared was also 4. Well, in this case, we don't have that situation, so I just have that x is equal to the cube root of 4. So I actually have 2 possible answers in this situation. Is equal to the cube root of 4. Now, practice some of these and let me know if you have questions.